The book comes out on Thursday. Why did you decide to write this book? What prompted you to write this book?
Yeah, absolutely. The book came out a couple of days ago and it's just been an absolute whirlwind. And part of what inspired it was what you said, Ayesha. It's to do with the fact that the wonderful job that you guys do as presenters is one part of the media story. And the other part of the media story is people like myself and your wonderful producers who do the behind the scenes, the power behind the throne, literally and figuratively in this case, who bring those extraordinary moments of television to air. And so the reason I wrote the book was really twofold. One, the tiny little piece in history that I have in bringing this interview in negotiating it, in turning it into the phenomenon that happened with brilliant Emily in that brilliant interview. But in a small part as well, if I may, this is for producers everywhere, it's going to shine a light on those layers and layers of work, effort, negotiation, and everything that is done behind the scenes in a way that I hope highlights not taking away from presenters, but just adding to the conversation about how production and how television and how the media works.
No, it's really, really important. And I should just say I'm very lucky to have a brilliant producer, Emily, who is absolutely fantastic, and Emma, who look after me very, very well. And of course, Adam is doing our technical stuff. And you're right, it's really important to recognise that there is a team. So look, let's go back to that interview. We just heard a clip. To me, it's like the Frost Nixon of our generation. How did it all begin? Because it sort of began with an emailed PR request. Take us through from the beginning
Absolutely.
to how this all happened.
It began in the most innocuous way. I mean, you never imagine, as an interviews producer, which is what I was for Paxman and then for Emily, you just get countless emails every day. And most of them you reply to, they come to nothing. This email was an invitation to have a conversation with the Duke of York.
So this came from his side?
This came from a PR working for his entrepreneurial organisation, which I don't think is any longer with us, but at the time was. And it was an invitation to do what we call a puff piece, which is a technical term that you may know, but perhaps they won't know out there, so let me explain. It's kind of like a flattering item where they get to say what they want. Now, we don't do those. So I politely declined. And I said, as I always did in hundreds of emails that I got almost every day at the end, oh, do get back to me if the situation changes and the Duke is open to a wider conversation that will conform with the editorial standards that we have as a programme. Of course, I never expected to hear back. Fast forward, Epstein's still alive. He hasn't been arrested. He's not dead. Maxwell isn't incarcerated, so a slightly different context. But in the May, prior to when you guys actually saw that interview, I then hear back from them. And they say to me, would you be amenable to coming to the palace to meet Amanda Thirsk? The first time I'd heard her name, the now sadly infamous chief of staff that used to work for Prince Andrew. Are you free on Monday? Well, I think I might be. So
I can be free on Monday.
I think I can make space in my calendar. And so I went along. The supposition was that he was now open to a wider conversation. And at that juncture, the most important things as a news journalist to get on the table in terms of an interview were Brexit. Do you remember those days?
Wow. And so what do you think changed their mind? Why do you think at that point they were suddenly open to a bigger, a Newsnight? And let's be honest, Newsnight is one of the toughest interviews like in town, right? Other than obviously Times Radio.
Obviously.
But why do you think the mood changed? Why do you think they thought, right, now's the right time to get in touch with Newsnight?
I've literally got no clue because I hadn't actually met them in the flesh. So, as much as I would love to say it was something to do with me at that juncture or my persuasive skills, which obviously later it was, at that particular point, it was just a random, actually, we'd like to do a longer interview. We're interested in doing something with you. So I went in with no expectations. I didn't even tell my boss.
So you just thought, well, probably nothing will come of this.
100%.
So what happened then? You went in to meet with Amanda Thirsk, and what happened?
It was a really interesting meeting because one of the things about negotiation is that it really is a very complex skill. It seems quite simple, picking up a phone, having conversations with people, but it's extremely difficult and it relies upon lots of calibrations. So I'd researched Amanda before I arrived, and I knew she was going to be extremely clever. She had a background in the city. She was formidable. I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean that in the nicest way.
As a compliment.
As an absolute compliment. She was, I understood from people who knew her, a woman's woman. She was bringing up some children on her own, as I was. And her husband was no longer with her. Mine was no longer with me for divorce and hers for other reasons, sadly. So I thought we would probably have that commonality. And that's really one of the biggest things about those kinds of meetings is trying to find a connection, trust and a connection. So I turned up to meet her And she was exactly as I imagined. Did not suffer fools gladly. Very, very bright questions. Lots of interrogation. I was there for 2 hours. And that was the first time we had what I would say was the crucial moment that meant that this interview happened. The bond of trust, integrity, mutual respect, and a proper, frank negotiation for 2 hours in that room with her.
And at the end of that meeting, did she say, yeah, I think I'm keen on this?
We got to the end of the meeting, and I have to say I was feeling quite good about myself in the sense that I'd managed to get onto the table from it being that puff piece that we'd initially discussed, Brexit, Meghan and Harry, you name it, the future of the monarchy, everything that you need as a news journalist to make sure that you do what the public want to hear. You ask the questions that matter, accountability issues. And then the last thing she said to me, and my stomach just dropped, there is one red line. And I was like, oh, God, what's the red line? I probably used a stronger word in my head, but we won't use that on Times Radio. Far too classy, I promise. And she said, Jeffrey Epstein, it's an old story. We won't take any questions on that. Now, that was in May. Wow. So it was before, it was actually, to be fair to her, kind of an old story. We would have, of course, asked about it, but it wasn't in the public frame. So I went back to the office feeling rather despondent because I knew that the excitement of potentially having bagged Newsnight's first ever interview with a member of the royal family, because we had never done one. We had no connections in the royal household. We had nobody who had done anything with us ever. I knew it was going to be over. And of course, the editor said no. So then that was declined. But I'd made a connection with Amanda. It was just the two of us for all those hours. We got on extremely well. And so I stayed in touch. And every time the story moved, as it did at a huge breakneck pace, arrested, Epstein arrested, charged, dead, Ghislaine Maxwell arrested. It was just incredible. Virginia Roberts giving interviews. Every time I would go back, I'd message, I'd call, I'd email, that merry dance between doing my job properly and being a pain in the butt, to be honest. And that's all I'm doing. I'm just trying to persuade Amanda to take one more meeting, take another meeting, take another meeting. And I waited.
And then she came back to you and said, yes?
Well, this was in May we did the first conversation. I kept in touch through all those many, many months. And then in October, she came back and said yes.
So the next big point of this journey is you all go in to have a meeting with the prince himself. And tell us about that, because he brings with him a very interesting person in his life.
That's right. Well, there's an interim meeting, but we won't go there because this meeting is the meeting of meetings.
It's the mother of all meetings.
It is the mother of all meetings, figuratively and literally. And we arrive, and obviously, you know, Emily is an extraordinarily impressive individual. My deputy editor, Stuart, was there for the first time. He'd not been to the palace before. It's quite an exciting thing. We were slightly like over-enthusiastic teenagers, I'm not going to lie.
You liked like competition winners.
It was kind of like professionalism usually high. On this day, it was quite overwhelming, even for someone like Emily. You know, we were all there in a moment that we knew was extremely important. It was all on the line. This was an extraordinary opportunity. Round the corner comes Prince Andrew. I half fall over doing my, curtsy bow. And as he arrives, extremely good mood, he goes, oh, by the way, I've brought someone with me. Now, I'm an ex-criminal defence barrister, as you know, and my presumption was, it's going to be a lawyer, and this is all going to be over. But instead, it was Princess Beatrice.
Wow.
And I can tell you the only thing more difficult than negotiating in Buckingham Palace with a member of the royal family about the alleged improprieties that he has committed of a sexual nature, extremely delicate, is in front of his daughter.
And do you think that's why he brought Beatrice into the room, to try and make it more difficult to have those conversations? Because, as you say, incredibly serious and quite tawdry allegations.
On the face of it, the reason he brought her is that they were going to have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea afterwards. So I don't think she'd known that he was doing this conversation. And when she found out, understandably, someone wanting to protect her father, obviously that's what any daughter would want to do, she asked to come along too. That was my impression, that she was kind of there apropos of nothing, and suddenly she was in that room with us, but a complete curveball in my negotiation tactic.
And did she contribute much to the meeting?
She did. I really think she was the rainmaker. You can imagine in that room, it's a very small room, and I was closer to Prince Andrew than I am to you. Emily was between the two of us. Princess Beatrice was here in the line of vision opposite me, Amanda Thirsk here, and Stuart right at the other end of the table. And I really felt that she was the rainmaker, because at the end of that interview, in a theoretical conversation with the Queen goes, so what do you think, darling? And Andrew will go, Emily Maitlis, she's incredible. Sam McAlister, she's great. Stuart was fab. We have to do this. And then she will turn to the sensible one, Princess Beatrice. And to me, crucially, her answer would be the difference between yes and no. So she asked very sensible questions that everybody else was probably, a little bit sort of circumspect about answering because the focus, understandably, was on Prince Andrew. But I answered them all because I felt that her element in that negotiation was absolutely crucial.
So I suppose the question that many of my listeners are asking right now, I mean, it's fascinating, all this colour about the negotiations, but you don't have to be a sort of mystic Meg person to work out that going in to do an interview with Newsnight, which is a very respected programme, Emily Maitlis, one of the top broadcasters in the land, it's not going to be a pushover. It's not going to be a puff piece, as you say. Why did they agree to do it? Because I presume in the interview, in these negotiations, you were all pretty candid with them saying, look, we are going to ask you what we're going to ask you. You were not going to be saying, we're not going to give you pre-prepared questions. We're not going to make this comfortable
Absolutely.
for you.
No conditions, no interview. And if there are conditions, we're out. I think the reason is probably threefold. I think the first reason is I feel with the benefit of hindsight, he was a bomb waiting to go off. He wanted to say something on the record at some juncture, and it was a matter of where it was going to be. The thrust of my negotiation and persuasion throughout, point 2, was that if you are going to do an interview, you have to do one, if you're trying to vindicate yourself as he was, that has that kite mark. It can't be a soft interview with some chummy bloke.
Right.
It has to be a proper interview because otherwise everyone will say, well, it wasn't even a real interview. It was a conversation between a couple of chums.
It was a soft soap,
a soft soap interview. So my argument was, if you're going to do it with someone like Emily. It has to be a woman, in my view, or don't bother at all. Now, that's a risk. Now, the third reason, in my view, nobody thinks they're going to do a bad interview. This is a man who's never been told that he's rubbish or useless. He's never been sacked. He's never had, an appraisal like we've had where we've been told we're a bit rubbish. He's never had to worry about food on the table. He has a level of, I don't mean it pejoratively, but there's a level of delusion that comes from that world that makes you think you are going to do really well.
So this is the crucial bit. This is the crucial bit of the jigsaw of understanding this. He thought he was going to knock it out of the park. He just thought he was going to go do this interview with Emily Maitlis, and he was going to be so good at this interview that would just settle the issue.
I really believe he thought that he would do this interview. He'd then be able to walk Beatrice down the aisle. That's the sweet spot that I talk about in the book, that you have to identify as a negotiator. He wanted to walk her down the aisle. He wanted to get back to his 60th birthday party that was coming up. He wanted to live his very, very, very lovely life. And in his view, I believe this was the way to get there. Unbelievable as that sounds now, this was the way to get there.
And do you think that he was not cognizant of who Emily Maitlis is? Like, do you think he'd ever watched an Emily Maitlis interview? Because if you are a sentient being, you know that Emily Maitlis is a really tough interviewer.
Look, he was very sentient of who Emily was. He really definitely knew who she was and he knew her reputation. But part of the interview that's really interesting is if you actually watch it back, and I'm sure you have, Emily is relentless in the way that she asks the questions, but the questions are infinitely predictable. They're quite simple and they're not at all aggressive. The thing that makes this interview the interview of interviews is the terrible, terrible answers, and he thought he was going to give good ones.
So we've talked quite a lot about the lead up to the interview and the negotiation. Let's move to the day of the interview, and we're going to play some clips to remind ourselves in a moment, Sam. But what was it like? Just give us some colour about what it was like going to set up for the interview. What was the atmosphere like? How did you and Emily and the rest of your team prepare for it? What were your nerves like? What was it like?
I mean, I was delirious, I'm not going to lie to you. By that stage, I'm quite a cool cucumber usually, but I was delirious. We hadn't slept. We were in a circle of trust. We knew if this got out, that it would be spiked. So we hadn't even told people in our own families. We hadn't slept. We did the negotiation, the final one, on the Monday. We heard yes on the Tuesday. We're back at Buckingham Palace just 48 hours later. 48 hours Emily had to prepare on the Thursday, and then you guys saw it on the Saturday.
Wow.
Not even a week. So you can imagine the levels of delirium. Everyone is working like a dervish. Stuart, who's the exec, Esme, who was our editor.
Esme Wren, yeah, brilliant.
Esme Wren,
yeah.
exactly, who was the one that was doing all the gaming, kind of. She was the adult left in the room. She didn't come to any negotiation. She didn't come to the interview, but she was back at home. She was the adult who was still sane. She was fantastic.
It's probably quite good to have that objectivity.
It was brilliant. Thank God. She's a brilliant editor, but the fact she didn't come to anything was hugely important. And so I arrived by bus. It was actually my day off. And I came in, understandably, to go to the interview. And when I arrived at the palace, other members of the team were on NDA. They didn't know who it was until they arrived. So I met the makeup woman. And she was coming in. She was very confused by what was happening. And she whispers to me, "Who is it?" And I went, "It's Prince Andrew." And she went, oh my God. And that was the feeling, because we knew what we had, we'd negotiated, but lots of the people in the room, the photographer, an amazing guy that did those incredible pictures, Mark Harrison, that you've all seen around the world, he didn't know until he arrived, the sound person. And so when we arrived, I arrived very, very early, as all your producers I'm sure would have done too. It was the career moment of my life. And then so did Prince Andrew. So we've got everything going on, the makeup artist, the sound artist, the camera people, everybody there, the producer, Jake Morris, who was working on the setup piece, we're all in there. And suddenly he arrives, half an hour early.
Just early?
It's his house, just early. He just came to have a look. And he walked in with the confidence of somebody who believes they're going to do a brilliant interview. And of course, because I'd met him before, and part of the producer's job is keeping the interviewee calm. It's doing the chit-chat. It's doing the warm-up, in a sense, right? And so I chatted with him. And we were very British. We talked about the weather. Good job. We talked about, it was very rainy that day. And we talked about cinema night. Because after we concluded that interview of interviews, in that room, there was going to be a cinema evening. It was going to be Renée Zellweger, and it was going to be Judy Garland film.
Wow.
So we chatted for about 10 minutes about the niceties of life, these little random things. And then he spoke to other members of the team in an extremely good mood. And then Emily arrived, and then it began.
And when you were in the room and he was saying things like that, did you just all have to keep poker faces, I presume?
100%.
Of course.
In a sense, it's easier being the presenter because you have to keep the poker professional face. Sitting 15 feet behind him, even as someone who'd been a criminal defence barrister, it was very hard not to react.
Oh, my goodness.
And that was the first of a number of bombshells. There's a chasm between what we usually call the briefing conversation. Producers, this is the curse of a producer. You say it on the briefing call, and then they never say it in the actual interview, and then you look like an idiot. Well, he said that in the negotiation.
So he brought
this... We knew it already.
So he introduced the sweating thing.
He introduced the sweating on the negotiation day. We heard that on the Monday. I never for one moment thought that you, the nation, would hear it on the Saturday. But you did.
So he obviously thought that this was like quite a really good bit of his defence argument.
He really did. And having been, as I said, a former criminal defence barrister,
course.
In that room when he said that during the negotiation, I was thinking this is a future prosecutor's dream for a number of reasons. One, because it's infinitely disprovable. Does that condition exist? Those poor people for the months afterwards having to say whether it did or not. But also because it just puts you, it's a hostage to fortune thing to say. Because you can make out it's true, and if it's not true, then you're a liar in the stand already. And the complexities of the case were such that that was really not the thing to choose to have a contentious conversation about.
I mean, it was from a legal point of view, sort of self-sabotage in many ways.
It was something about the fact that we'd heard so many extraordinary things. And when you watch the interview back, all the things that became the memes, the things that became... We changed the discourse of popular culture. They have gone into the lexicon. But that moment where he talks about a positive action, where he's talking and alluding to sexual acts in that way, to me was the epitome of everything that was wrong with that interview in terms of the way he presented himself, in terms of the way he communicated, and in terms of the outcomes. So speaking with my double brain as barrister and journalist, I was in pain listening to that response.
Now, he, of course, maintains his innocence. It's really important to say that he rejects all the allegations
100%.
that have been made against him. But of course, we also know that he has paid a significant amount of money to Virginia Giuffre. I mean, what do you think the consequences were of this incredible interview? And also, when you left the room, what was the mood like? Did he think he'd done a good interview? Did the three of you and did your team, did you realise what had just happened and how box office and explosive this was going to be?
There was an astronomically bizarre parting of the ways. We got to the end of the interview. I'm sitting next to a charming woman who's the equerry. That's apparently a royal executive assistant. I didn't know, I had to ask. And I'm very bad at being insincere, which has been terrible. I'm a lawyer and a journalist. Sorry, it's been really, really a problem for my life. And I have to say something real. So I turn to her and very carefully, in a slightly high-pitched voice, I say, so how do you think it went? It's a sincere question, right? And she said, wasn't he wonderful? And I said, in all sincerity, yes, he was. And then I raised my eyes and imagine that room, that vast room with all those people, and you see the schism writ large in front of you. The journalists, everyone on the Newsnight team, aghast, knowing what we have, and him looking extremely happy, and offering Emily Maitlis and the rest of us a tour of the palace. That's how well he thought it had gone.
And you didn't have any pushback from the palace afterwards saying, actually, we want to change the terms of engagement. We weren't happy with those questions that you asked. You know, we didn't think that was fair. There was nothing like that.
That was the most shocking part of this. Nothing.
Wow.
Not a call, nothing. I have to say, as an individual, you know, as a producer, I was a bit fearful. There isn't any particular reason that I was. Nothing was ever said to me or done to me. But it did feel, I understood in that second what we had. And I couldn't believe it would make it to air.
Sam, we've got a few minutes left before we get to the top of the hour. I mean, how much do you think this interview changed the course of history for Prince Andrew and for the royal family, potentially?
I mean, I don't know for certain, but my feeling on it is that it was a huge, huge moment, obviously for him, for Virginia, who you've mentioned, her courageous campaign to bring someone to justice, which this interview assisted with in a profound and great way, because that man was not a man who could stand in a witness box. I tell you that for nothing, I'm sure we know. And I also feel that it changed actually the course of everything else that happened. We understand that Maxwell herself, she felt this was one of the reasons that she was suddenly found and arrested after having been effectively on the run for a long time. We understand potentially that it had an effect upon Mexit. It could have had an effect upon that too. But more profoundly, it was a moment in which somebody who was accused of a heinous and terrible act was brought to account.